Hello, everybody, and welcome to this first lecture in Oceanography. I hope you enjoy this class. We're going to be going over today a rather unusual subject. We're going to be starting off talking about the philosophy of science. So mostly the goal today is to delineate what is science and what isn't science. That's what we want to establish. So I'm going to give you some tools for being able to discern the difference between what is real science and what is not science at all, what we can use science, where we can use science, where we can't use science. So that's the goal for today. We'll also be talking a little bit about what is oceanography, so you get a little bit of introduction to the subject that we're going to spend the next 25 lectures exploring. So without further ado, we'll get right into this. So let me go ahead and give you a little bit of intro first, just who I am, since you're going to be spending some time with me. I'm, of course, Dr. Hurt, Professor Hurt. I have 3 kids, or as of right now, at least recording this, I have 3 kids. Who knows, I might have more in the future. But so there's just some pictures of my children. I guess probably they're a little older now, but there's my lovely wife and my 3 kids. So just a little bit of background. I'm from Southern California here, so you can see the traffic there, and that's one of the reasons I left and came here to Texas. But so there's the traffic in California. I went to UCLA for my bachelor's degree in geology, and then I did my PhD at University of Michigan in earth and environmental science. So oceanography is kind of part of earth sciences, so that's why I'm here teaching this class. So anyway, but I like Corpus Christi. I don't have any plans to move away from here, so it's a great place, and I intend to stay here at Del Mar. So anyway, getting on to the course material. So what is science? So one of the first questions I ask you in your lecture assignment packet is what's the difference between a cosmos and a chaos? So the word cosmos and chaos, actually they're both coming from Greek words. In this case, a cosmos it actually means something like order or arrangement. So I know a lot of times when you think of the word cosmos, probably you're thinking of like space. But really, I show like a puzzle that's all put together here, because really what it means is that there's order and arrangement. Things kind of fit together and they make sense. Okay. On the other hand, you know what a chaos is, right? A chaos would be all those puzzle pieces all mixed up and jumbled up. There's no order. There's no rhyme and reason for things. It's just randomness. So both those words, cosmos and chaos, they come from Greek words. And they're actually opposites of each other. So, we live in a cosmos. So cosmos means that there's order, there's reason, there's rationality, there's a rhyme, there's a reason to everything. So there's order to everything. So because we live in a cosmos, we live in an ordered universe. What does it mean? It means that the natural world is ordered, it's rational, and it is intelligible. That's a really important term right here, intelligible. What intelligible means is that, a message that is intelligible, what does that mean? It means that you can make sense of it. And that's true for the natural world. We can, with our intelligence, make sense of the natural world, right? So the fact that the world is intelligible is very important. You shouldn't just take that for granted. I put down here, don't take it for granted that we live in a cosmos and not a chaos. All science depends on that fact. It depends on the fact that we live in a cosmos. We live in an ordered, intelligible world, right? Because we could have lived in who knows, we could have lived in a chaos, and then we wouldn't be able to do science because we can't make sense of a chaos. All right, so moving along here. What is science, right? That's the main point that we're trying to establish here. Well, science is, and there's a lot of different definitions you could use, but science, in this course, the way I'm going to explain it is that science is a methodical reasoning, and it's ordered towards discovering the truth. It's ordered, about finding out the truth about the physical universe, and it's based on observation. Okay, so let me break this down a little bit for you. Oh, by the way, before I cover this, um, I do kind of want to explain also where this word science comes from. Um, we refer to this origin of words as etymology. So sometimes you'll hear me in this course. Actually, often I explain the etymology of different words because personally I find it helpful to remember what the word means if I remember the etymology. But anyway, what is science? What does science actually mean? Or what does that word actually come from? So that word science comes from a Latin word. The Latin word is scientia. And scientia is basically it's roughly equivalent to knowledge. However, there are actually two terms that both mean knowledge in Latin. So there's scientia, and there's also another word that means knowledge called sapientia. And so sapientia also means knowledge. However, sapientia can also be maybe likened to something like wisdom. So sapientia maybe is it's like a knowledge, but it's knowledge of perhaps kind of deeper things, things of life and love and the meaning of life and maybe morality or things like that. Okay, so it has to do with philosophical things, whereas scientia is a kind of knowledge of sort of practical, factual things or everyday things. Okay, so the term science it comes from scientia. It means knowledge. All right, and it's not just it's not just any knowledge. It's knowledge specifically of kind of like created things of the world. Okay, practical everyday things of the world, rather than ideas and philosophies. Okay, so that's where that comes from. So I want to break this down a little bit. This definition I gave you of science. So one thing I said is that it's methodical reasoning, right? So methodical. What does that mean? It's methodical. Well, it means that it's based on the scientific method, right? So I'm sure that when you hear methodical, scientific method, that methodical is referring to the method. Okay. Now, of course, science, is also about the truth. Right, that's what we're trying to find out when we do science. We want to know the truth about how the world works. Okay, and so it's oriented towards the truth. We're interested in finding the truth, and it's also all about the physical universe. So in science, we're only studying the physical universe. We're not studying things that are non-physical. So it's only the physical universe, and it's also based on observation. So that word, based on observation, we have a word called empirical. Okay, empirical. What does empirical mean? It means based on observation. So we often say that the sciences are empirical. Okay. Now, science is also focused on the natural physical world. Like I said, we don't look at things, we don't pay attention to things in science that are not physical. Okay, so that means that we are interested in things that are consisting of matter, energy. They exist in time and space. Okay. Now, some people might say, fairly, well, Dr. Hurt, isn't everything like that? Isn't everything just physical? And that's not exactly true. A lot of things are physical, but not everything is physical. Ideas are very important, but they're not physical. They exist in your mind, but your mind is not physical. I know that, of course, you have a brain, but your brain is physical, but your brain is not your mind. There's a difference between your mind and your brain. Your brain is physical, but your mind is not. Ideas that exist in your mind are not physical, right? Logic is not physical. Mathematical truths, math is real, right? There's truth about math. There's mathematical truth, right? 1 + 1 = 2, no matter what culture or what time you live in, right? But it's not physical, right? Mathematical truths are not physical. So a lot of people believe in a soul, right? Soul is not physical. So there's all sorts of things. We could go on and on talking about things that are not physical. But the point is that science doesn't study things like this. So all this stuff, you can put a big X through it. Not that it's not important, but just that we don't study it in science. We only study things that are physical, that exist in time, space, that consist of matter, energy, etc., etc. So we're focused on the physical universe. Like I said, we're methodical. That means we follow the scientific method. So it's another important point. I'm sure that you've heard of the scientific method before, but just to go over it a little bit and remind you of some things, because I do ask about it on the test. What is the scientific method? Well, you could break it down into 5 steps. I break it down at least into 5 steps. So first of all, the first step is observation, right? So it means that you're looking, you're keeping your eyes peeled, your eyes open, and you encounter something in nature that makes you say, that's interesting. I wonder why that happens. I wonder how that works, right? So very, very good example of that would be, you notice that in the wintertime, the leaves fall off the trees, right? And you might ask yourself, well, why do the leaves fall off the trees? Of course, we don't get beautiful fall colors like this here in Corpus Christi, but I'm sure you have noticed that the leaves do fall off the trees. Okay, so you might wonder why. That would be your first observation. Kind of something that makes you say, I wonder why that happens. Okay, the second part of the scientific method is you propose a hypothesis. So you try to come up with an explanation that seeks to explain why that happens. Okay, so we want to come up with an explanation that explains why do the leaves fall off the trees. Okay, well, maybe we could come up with different hypotheses, right? One hypothesis is that it gets cold, right? So it gets cold, and that causes the trees to say, "Oh, it's wintertime. I have to shed my leaves." Okay, so that's one possible hypothesis. But there are other hypotheses. For example, that during the winter time, what else happens? It's not that it just gets cold. It also we get shorter days, right? The number of daylight hours shortens. Okay, so that's another possible explanation, right? So we have to try to figure out now, which of these hypotheses, or maybe both of them, are correct, or maybe neither of them are correct. So we have to try to come up with an explanation, and see which explanation is correct, which one isn't. So what we're going to do now is we're going to make a prediction. And the prediction is going to be based off the hypothesis or the hypotheses. What is a prediction? Here's a guy using, a crystal ball. They're trying to look into the future, right? So that's all a prediction is. You're trying to guess what's going to happen based off your hypotheses. So one thing we could say is that, well, here, maybe if the leaves fall off the trees because it gets cold, if that's true, then we should be able to take a tree, keep it in a greenhouse over the winter, and it should retain its leaves, if that's true. So we can test the prediction with an experiment. We can actually take all those plants and put them in the greenhouse and just see what happens. Right? Are they going to lose their leaves or not? So we can carry out the experiment. That's the 4th step. And then finally, we just analyze our results. Right? That's the last step. We want to analyze the results and see if they corroborate with the hypothesis or not. If they corroborate the hypothesis, they agree with the hypothesis, then we can accept our hypothesis. If not, then we have to reject or modify our hypothesis. Okay. Now, in this case, I do want to kind of make a distinction between a hypothesis and things like theories and laws, because hypotheses don't have very many facts backing them up yet. Right? They don't have many observations or experiments or much evidence backing it up yet. So a hypothesis is just kind of like a proposed explanation that hasn't yet garnered much evidence to support it yet. Okay. Another distinction I want to make here is between a hypothesis and a prediction. I notice that many people confuse a hypothesis and a prediction. I often hear people saying, and even teachers saying, What do you hypothesize is going to happen? In this experiment, what do you hypothesize is going to happen? Well, that doesn't make any sense. That's not a hypothesis, right? What do you predict is going to happen is correct. Hypothesis is the explanation, right? Hypothesis always seeks to explain why something happens, okay? A prediction is a guess at what is going to happen based on the hypothesis. If the hypothesis is true, we expect X, Y, Z to occur, okay? So a hypothesis, often has something like a because, because we see the leaves fall off the trees, because it gets colder, because the daylight hours are shortening, because we're trying to establish a causal relationship. We're trying to explain what causes one thing to occur. Okay, so that would be a little bit about the difference between a hypothesis and a prediction. So I do ask about that on the test. So make sure you understand the difference between the two of those. Okay. All right. So to be science, we've learned that it has to be observable. Okay, it has to be based on observations. Okay, observations of the physical world. Now, in science, we have two kinds of observations. Okay, so this is in your lecture assignment, I'm asking about this. What's the difference between a qualitative and a quantitative observation? So some observations are quantitative, some observations are qualitative. Okay, qualitative observations are based on qualities. Okay, so it could be things like maybe color or shape or form or something like that. So imagine a sea voyage goes out, and a scientific voyage, and it collects it discovers new species, right? A new animal or new kind of plankton or something like that. You can't describe that in a quantified measurement way, right? It's a qualitative observation. You describe how this new species looks and the way it's shaped and et cetera, right? Now, on the other hand, we also have quantitative observations. So quantitative observations are when they're based on quantities. So quantitative observations are things that we measure. So whenever we measure something, that's a quantitative observation. Okay, so it's qualitative, that's based on qualities. Then quantitative is based on quantities, and that's a measurement. Okay, so always in science, we try as much as we can to be quantitative. That's not always possible. Like I gave you the example of discovering a new species, right? A new marine species, for instance, in oceanography. Well, you can't describe a new species with just numbers, right? You can't just measure something. That might be an important aspect of it, but you can't describe a new species just with numbers, right? So there's qualitative characteristics you have to describe. All right, just something for you all to think about. What are some properties of the physical world that we can measure? What are some things that are measurable extents? Okay, just a little word here, vocab word that you should know. This word dimension. What is a dimension? A dimension is just any kind of measurable extent. It's something that can be measured, right? So what are some things? What are some dimensions of the universe? What are some dimensions of the things that you can measure? So it might interest you to know that there's actually only 7 totally independent dimensions that can be measured in the universe. So these are the 7 things that can actually be directly measured. Everything else breaks down into some combination of these 7. So the 7 are distance, time, mass, temperature, electrical charge, and amount of a substance, and also luminosity. So probably a lot of these things you already know what they are. Luminosity is how much light something gives off. Electrical charge we don't really talk about too much, but of course in oceanography we talk a lot about distances. And distances, by the way, that includes surface areas and volumes, right? Because the surface area is just a distance in 2 dimensions, and a volume is just a distance in 1, 2, 3 dimensions, right? And we talk, of course, about time and mass and temperature. But we don't talk very much about electrical charge and things like that in oceanography. Okay. So anyway, I'm gonna skip some of this stuff because we don't really talk about it too much in the lecture assignment. But anyway, let's get on to the next topic here. So observation, that's a necessary aspect of science. So to have like a valid scientific inquiry, valid scientific question, or to have a valid scientific hypothesis or claim, it has to be something observable, something that we can collect evidence about, something that we can see, something we can touch or smell or whatever. But it has to be observable. You have to be able to observe it. Okay. The next part is falsifiable. Another term for falsifiable is verifiable. So falsifiable, verifiable, things like that. Okay. Let me explain what that possibly means. Yet another way of saying it: falsifiability, falsifiable, verifiable, or refutable. Okay, those are all ways that we refer to the same principle, and this is the principle I'm about to explain. It's the capacity for a statement, a theory, hypothesis, whatever, to be contradicted by evidence. So that means that it can be proven wrong with evidence. Okay, and evidence means something specific. Okay? Evidence means an observation, data. Okay, qualitative or quantitative observations. Okay, so for example, the statement, "All swans are white," is that falsifiable? Yes, it is falsifiable because it can be contradicted by evidence. So, for example, there are such things as black swans. Okay, so we could prove that statement either false or true with evidence. Okay, so it has to be capable of contradicting it with evidence. Okay. Now, there's so many ways that students kind of go wrong with this. So I want to explain some of the ways people go wrong with this. One student came to me and said, I asked him, come up with a statement that's falsifiable or not falsifiable. And the student said, how about this? Here's a statement that's not falsifiable. There are aliens, right? And I said, well, how is that not falsifiable? And they said, well, it's because we've never seen aliens before. And I said, yeah, but we might see them in the future. So then that statement could be, it's not that it has been falsified or it is falsified or it is false. It's that it's capable of being proven incorrect by evidence. So we could theoretically make an observation that proves it true by evidence. Let me give you more examples because this is a really difficult concept. Okay, let's say there was a scientist and they wanted to do a scientific study to verify that bachelors are unmarried. Bachelors are unmarried. Okay, that would be silly, right? And you all know it'd be silly. Often in class I say this and people are kind of giggling, right? It's silly, right? Because that to be a bachelor means that you're unmarried. You could not go out and falsify that with evidence. Because why? Because that's what it means to be a bachelor, right? Being unmarried is part of what it means to be a bachelor. You have to be a man and you have to be unmarried, okay? So your hypothesis could not be falsified by evidence. Your hypothesis could not be falsified by evidence. Okay, so what are some things that are so you could see things that are not falsifiable. You have to be careful here because sometimes people get confused between just being false and being falsifiable. Okay, here's another mistake I saw a student make. They said, can you think of an idea that's not falsifiable? I often ask this to my students in lecture class, when we're face-to-face. Can you think of an idea that's not falsifiable? Okay, maybe you could take a minute, try to think of an idea that's not falsifiable. So I had a student once say this was not correct. I got it. How about this? The sky is blue. So the sky is blue, so therefore it cannot be proven false, so therefore it is not falsifiable. So no, that doesn't work. The sky is blue actually is falsifiable. It happens to be true that the sky is blue. But we're able to verify or falsify that with evidence. Okay? So that's why sometimes we don't just call this falsifiability, sometimes we call this verifiability, okay? Or refutability. It means that something you have to be able to verify or falsify the statement with evidence, with an observation, okay? So just because it happens to be true or happens to be false doesn't have any bearing on whether it's falsifiable, okay? There can be ideas that are false that are falsifiable. For example, all swans are white. That's false, but it's also falsifiable. You can prove it's false. In the same way, the sky is blue is true, but it's possible to falsify. It's possible to do an observation and either prove that it's true or prove that it's false with an observation. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. Yet another example, math, right? We don't verify mathematical truths by evidence and observation, okay? We don't, so imagine this. Can we say, let's say we want to know, does 1 plus 1 equal 2? Does 1 plus 1 equal 2? We cannot go out and contradict that with evidence or collect evidence to contradict that, right? That would be impossible to do. So again, mathematical truths are not falsifiable. Okay, they can be proven false or proven true. There are mathematical theorems that can be proven true or proven false using rules of logic, but we don't do that with evidence. Okay, so I hope that makes some sense. The last thing about science is that science has to be reproducible. So that means that other people have to be able to come and make the same observations that you made. Like in the case of an experiment, somebody needs to be able to come, do your experiment, repeat your experiment, and they should get the same results. Okay? So that's another thing that's necessary for science. It needs to be reproducible. So one of the ways that, for example, things are not reproducible, or certain phenomena are not reproducible, are, for example, one-time historical occurrences. We don't usually study those kinds of things with science, because one-time historical occurrences, like Washington crossing the Delaware River or something, we can't reproduce those events, right? So we can't study those events with science, and we have a whole subject of history that studies things like that. Same thing with things that might happen in the future, one-time future events that are going to happen once. They're not reproducible events, so we can't study those things with science. So to sum it up, a question, to be science, you have to be observable. You have to be, it has to be something observable. It has to be possible to prove it or disprove it with an observation. And also that evidence and those observations that you collected have to be generally viewable and reproducible by other people. We need to be able to repeat the process and have it get the same results over and over again and make the same observations over and over again. So just some more examples. I ask you to come up with a question that is impossible to answer scientifically, right? So here are just some examples of it, right? So science, what part of the brain is active when somebody is in love? We can study that with science. We can study the brain. However, science cannot answer what is love, right? That's a question of meaning, and questions of meaning are not invisible basically to science. We can't assess questions like that. We can't tell what the meaning of different terms or different words are. That's a subject for philosophy. We can answer the question in science, what is the average discharge of the Delaware River, right? But we can't study Washington crossing the Delaware River, right? Because that's a one-time historical event that's not reproducible. But studying the discharge of the Delaware River, generally speaking, is possible because other people can come and reproduce the same observation, make the same observation, get the same results. Science, we can study the surface area of the Earth and we can measure the surface area of the Earth. However, we can't say basic mathematical truths like what is 1 + 1 equal. We don't use science to study mathematical questions like that, right? Those are established through math and logic, not through science, not through observation. Okay? So that's a little intro to science, and I kind of hope that we sort of delineated and helped you to see what is science and what is not science, okay? Because not everything is science, obviously. All right, so moving on, that's science. What's oceanography? That's what we're going to study for the rest of the term, right? So what's oceanography? And that's what we aim to answer in the second half of the lecture. So just to give you a little bit of a planetary perspective on this, a solar system-wide perspective on this. Okay, what planets in our solar system have oceans? That's the first question I ask here. Your lecture assignment in this section. What planets in our solar system have water? Okay, have oceans. Well, we have four terrestrial planets. We have 8 planets altogether. Okay, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. Okay, which have oceans. Well, as far as we know, it's just Earth. Okay, and that's really interesting. Why don't Venus and Mars, our neighbors, why don't they have oceans, right? So we'll talk more about that a little bit later. So you take a look at Mercury. Mercury looks a lot like our moon, right? But obviously no oceans. Okay, Venus, same thing, a very thick atmosphere on Venus. Yet, you can see from this picture, you don't even see the craters on Venus because you just see the atmosphere. But yet, no oceans, right? We actually did send, or I shouldn't say we, but the Soviets actually sent a rover to Venus and took pictures off the surface of Venus, which are pretty interesting. But you can see it's basically like a barren hellscape. It's not there's no water in sight. And of course, the surface of Venus is extremely hot. It's about 600 degrees Celsius and hot enough to melt lead. Okay, so no water there. Mars, maybe a little bit of soil moisture, but you could see it looks like a desert, barren hellscape, right? It's pretty dry and barren. Okay, so it's very interesting though, right? Really think about it. Earth has abundant water, okay? Has abundant water, but Venus and Mars do not have any. So why is that? That's a huge, huge question in planetary sciences, okay? Why does Earth have water, but Mars, Venus, they don't have water, okay? So Earth has water, it has abundant water, right? 71% of our surface is covered with water. What about water? Is there any water anywhere else in the solar system? I only talked about planets, but there are possibly some other solar system bodies that have water. One big possibility is one of the Galilean moons of Jupiter, Europa. This is one of the big moons of Jupiter. Jupiter has 4 big moons that you can see easily with a telescope. Even a good pair of binoculars, you can sometimes see them. But it has 4 moons. Europa is one of them. And Europa is covered with solid ice. It has a kind of a solid ice crust. But it's very possible that beneath that solid ice, H2O, watery crust, icy crust, there could be liquid water. And that's because that Earth, or I shouldn't say Earth, but a planet, gives off some internal heat from its core, from its insides. And that might be enough to melt the ice near the surface. So a kind of artist's rendition of what they think it might look like on Europa. You see these geysers erupting liquid water from the icy surface. Okay, you can see Jupiter here looming in the background. So could there be even life on Europa? And we don't know. Definitely, it's a priority of NASA and some of the space research organizations to explore Europa. There's a lot of talk about right now at this point of trying to send submersibles, there to try to explore those possible oceans and see. But it's quite a technological challenge, right? You need to be able to land a satellite onto a rocket onto the surface of Europa, drill beneath the ice, and deposit a submersible in there and have it collect data for however long it lasts. It's difficult because it cannot collect sunlight to recharge its batteries, being under the ice, as it were. So it'd have a limited life, but be very interested. There's a lot of life in the hydrothermal vents that are on the bottom of our ocean. This is not a picture of Europa. This picture Earth. Could there be life in Europa's seas, right? So we don't know. So there's the 4 Galilean moons. 3 of these moons possibly have water. Europa almost definitely has water, but there might be water on the other ones as well. Ganymede and Callisto. Another possible body in the solar system that we think has water is Enceladus, which is one of the small moons of Saturn. This is a real picture of a recent flyby by the Cassini probe, and it photographed geysers of water. So it was able to actually verify that these things that you see coming up from the surface is in fact liquid water being ejected from the surface. So there is definitely liquid water, or almost definitely liquid water, spouting out of the surface. So again, the ocean would exist under a thick ice layer that's on top. Okay. All right, now I want you to take a look at the picture here below. So here's, of course, this is Earth, much more attractive place, right? Just take a look at this picture. What are some of the features that were either directly or indirectly created by water, or influenced or affected by water, or consist of water? Okay. Well, just take a look, and what do you think? So one thing is actually, I have here the continents. It might surprise you to learn that the continents need water to form. You cannot form the continents geologically without water. Water is a necessary ingredient to form the continents. Okay. But of course, bodies of water. This lake obviously is water. All of the life that you see on the surface consists of water. Anywhere between 60 to 98% water. The clouds are water, right? Clouds are liquid water or ice. Okay. Right. The oxygen that's in the atmosphere and the air, right, contains water. Think about the erosion that takes place. That's whittling down these mountains and destroying these mountains slowly. That's a lot of that is done by water. So water is just extremely important and consequential for our planet. And it is kind of interesting because of course we have water on our planet, but it's really not that much water. So this is kind of an interesting picture if you take a look at this. This is if you were to take all of the world's water and put it in a single drop. That's how big it would be compared to the Earth. So, you can see that the oceans are relatively small compared to, they cover a lot of Earth. They cover 71% Earth. But it's really kind of relatively small. It's spread out. It's a small amount of water that's spread over the surface of the Earth, right? So relative to the size of the Earth, it's very, very small. So that big drop is all the water on the surface of Earth. This smaller drop is liquid fresh water, and that consists mostly of groundwater and glaciers. And that teeny weeny little dot that you probably can't hardly even see, that's all of the freshwater lakes and rivers. So think of the Great Lakes and the African Great Lakes and our Great Lakes, and that teeny little dot is just smeared thinly over that surface. So just to kind of give you some perspective, okay? So what percent of Earth is covered with oceans? You know that that Earth is about 71% covered with 71% ocean. What percent of Earth's water is in the ocean? Well, it's about 97%. Okay, 96.5%. So, if you throw in the Great Lakes, like big salt lakes and things like that, you find that about 97.2% is salt water, and then there's only about 2.8% that's fresh water. Okay, so fresh water is a very small amount of all of Earth's surface water. Okay, of that fresh water, most of it is actually in glaciers and ice caps and things like that. Okay, so it's kind of amazing because of the fresh water we have, most of it is in a glacier. Okay. Earth is, of course, covered in terms of how it's covered. It's covered 71% of it's covered with water. Okay. Now, of course, first thing you got to know in oceanography, you have to know the oceans. So make sure that you know the oceans. Now, of course, I'm sure that you're all familiar with Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian Oceans. But there are two others that you might not know. The Arctic Ocean, it's about 7% of the size of Pacific, so it's fairly small. And the Southern Ocean, that's down here near the Antarctic. Okay, the Pacific is the largest and the deepest ocean. It has an average depth of about 4 kilometers. Okay, 4,000 meters. Oh, you might be familiar with the metric system, you might not. Luckily, the next lecture we're going to do is on the metric system, so you'll have a little bit more perspective about what those numbers mean. Okay. So anyway, so make sure that you know where, the oceans, the world. The Pacific Ocean is actually about half of the water, of the ocean water, is Pacific Ocean water. The Atlantic is maybe 30%. The Indians maybe 25%. And the Arctic and Southern together, pretty small sliver of that. Okay. So a little bit later, we're going to talk about metric system in the next lecture. We're going to talk about global geography, and after that, we're going to start getting into like continents and ocean crust and the differences between them. But so that's all for right now. Hope you enjoyed the lecture. Please let me know if you have any questions or concerns, and I'll talk to you next time.